They called it audacity in the public briefings, a bold thrust through the Netherlands that would seize a string of vital bridges and, in theory, carry armored columns across the Rhine within days. In the newspapers and on parade grounds, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood at the center of that narrative, an architect of high spectacle, arguing that a sharp, surgical strike could shorten the war. Behind the maps and the speeches, however, a different conversation threaded through the British and American staffs, a mix of conviction, unease, and contingency thinking that often never left the minutes or private memos. What Allied leaders really thought about Operation Market Garden was rarely a single verdict. It was a cluster of judgments, hedges, and rationalizations formed in the claustrophobic space between intelligence reports, logistical realities, and political expectation. By mid-September 1944, the strategic landscape set the stage. The Allied armies had broken out of the Normandy lodgment and, through a combination of daring advances and German paralysis, were sweeping across northern France and into Belgium. Momentum favored the Allies, and there was genuine belief in some circles that the German war machine was collapsing. Yet momentum produced its own pressures. Sustaining an advance across hundreds of miles of European road and rail required an unrelenting supply chain. Fuel and repair parts were never guaranteed. Political leaders in London and Washington were already impatient with a war that stretched into a second year. Public appetite for a decisive stroke to hasten victory was palpable. Against that background, commanders at the front and their superiors in headquarters were asked to reconcile an appetite for boldness with the arithmetic of logistics and the fog of imperfect information. Into that friction, Montgomery proposed a solution of surgical boldness. The core idea was deceptively simple on a map: drop thousands of airborne troops to seize and hold key river and canal crossings across the Netherlands, Eindhoven, Grave, Nijmegen, and Arnhem, and then drive a thrust along the resulting corridor, with armored units punching north to relieve the isolated airborne formations. The ambition was to create a single narrow armored artery, 38th Corps pushing up from the south, linking each captured bridge to the next, until the defenders on the Rhine were outflanked and the path into northern Germany opened. Montgomery's pitch traded depth for speed. If the Allies could move faster than the Germans could marshal, the operation could bypass the deliberate, attritional approach that had strangled offenses earlier in the campaign. That map-level clarity masked a host of operational assumptions: that the airborne forces could seize and hold the bridges long enough for the ground corridor to advance, that the corridor itself would remain navigable under pressure from traffic, terrain, and German countermeasures, that surprise and momentum would keep major German armored formations out of the corridor during the critical window, and that Allied air mobility, gliders and parachute lifts, would be sufficient to insert troops, heavy weapons, and limited supplies and sustain them until relief. Those assumptions were not hidden. They were argued for openly in planning rooms. What differed among leaders was the confidence with which they endorsed them and the contingency plans they insisted upon. Montgomery was the public and private engine of the plan. He saw Market Garden as the kind of decisive, elegance-driven operation that suited his style: centralized control, bold objectives, and rapid, calculated risk. His staff records and published accounts make clear that he believed in seizing the initiative rather than grinding forward in attrition. That belief had strategic logic. If it worked, the payoff would be disproportionate, but it also carried the danger of single-point failure. Allies who looked on the map saw one narrow road slicing between dikes and rivers, flanked by cropland and small towns. For Montgomery, that seemed manageable. For others, the corridor's narrowness was a glaring vulnerability. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower occupied a different administrative posture. He supervised the coalition's overall conduct, balancing American and British priorities, and, crucially, the need to manage scarce resources across multiple theaters. Eisenhower's recorded decisions and staff correspondence indicate that he was receptive to Montgomery's plan when it promised to maintain strategic momentum, but also aware of the political dimension. In conversations preserved in dispatches and later memoirs, he weighed the immediate military advantages against the risks presented by extended lines of supply and the uncertainties of airborne operations. Eisenhower did not unreservedly endorse the scheme from the start. He accepted it in the context of coalition politics, limited alternative options, and the pressure to keep the war's tempo. In short, he tolerated a gamble that he did not entirely embrace. These were not merely tactical debates. The plan's advocates and skeptics framed Market Garden through different lenses. For many British planners, Montgomery's gamble was the type of operation that could return initiative and prestige to British forces after Normandy's grind.
American corps and Army commanders, conditioned by longer logistical chains and the need to hold broad fronts, were more cautious about committing armored formations to a single narrow axis.
That tension between the spectacle of a decisive maneuver and the sober arithmetic of supply and defense manifested not only in memos but at the map tables, where corps commanders and their chiefs argued over timings and resources. Operational staff work settled several key institutional assignments. Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, coordinating airborne operations, was assigned the task of integrating the parachute and glider drops across the multiple objectives. Browning's role, as reflected in staff minutes and after-action summaries, was to balance what airborne forces could take and hold against the constraints of airlift and the limited ability to resupply once on the ground. Major General Roy Urquhart, commanding 1st Airborne Division, would shoulder the most visible risk. His men would land on the outskirts of Arnhem with the task of seizing the bridge over the lower Rhine and holding it until relieved. Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, leading XX Corps, would have to push north along a single corridor notorious for its narrow bridges and bottlenecks. These assignments reflected both organizational logic and a chain of risk. The airborne formations were the forward tip, the ground corps the critical lifeline, and the staff planners the connective tissue attempting to reconcile the two. Planning discussions made clear one central vulnerability. Market Garden depended on precise timing. If the airborne units could seize and hold, and if the ground forces could push quickly enough without being stopped by unexpected enemy armor or terrain-induced delays, the plan could achieve its objective. If one link of that chain broke, if drops were mislocated, if bridges were not secured, if traffic jams stalled tank brigades, then the entire enterprise risked collapse. That fragility was well understood at many levels, even among those who supported the operation. The question for commanders became one of acceptable risk and informed consent. Did the prospect of a decisive stroke justify placing thousands of men in positions where relief could be late or impossible? Intelligence fed both confidence and concern. Allied signals intelligence, ULTRA, aerial reconnaissance, and reports from the Dutch resistance created a mosaic of sometimes contradictory inputs. Some intercepts suggested that German formations in the immediate Arnhem area were depleted or refitting. Other reports hinted at armored units moving through the sector. Dutch resistance cells, risking their lives to report troop movements, offered local detail that was invaluable but uneven in coverage and often difficult to corroborate. Reconnaissance flights provided imagery of bridges and local defenses, but were hampered by weather and the difficulty of distinguishing units in scattered small towns and hiding positions. Operational summaries circulated to headquarters noted warnings that should have altered risk calculations.
Contemporary intelligence summaries, as recorded in staff logs and later analyses, indicated the presence of armored formations in northeastern Netherlands, references that have been interpreted by historians as evidence that German panzer units were nearer than planners assumed. The granularity of that intelligence and the degree to which it was trusted varied. Some staff officers treated the reports as contingent, useful to factor in but not decisive, while others argued for a more cautious stance. The signal-to-noise problem was real. In September 1944, the Allies were intercepting volumes of traffic from multiple fronts, and parsing which intercepts demanded immediate operational changes was as much art as science. On the maps and in the briefings, the geography of Market Garden read like a series of strategic hinges. Eindhoven, the southmost major crossing, would be seized to secure the initial anchor of the corridor. Grave and Nijnhoven were intermediate nodes whose bridges served to carry the axis north. Arnhem, 70-some miles into the corridor and astride the lower Rhine, represented the operational gamble's culminating objective. A small force occupying the bridge at Arnhem could control the eastern approaches, allowing armored units to pass into Germany. That prospect enamored advocates. It also concentrated risk. Arnhem's bridge, long and exposed, would be a magnet for German counteraction. To understand what leaders thought, one must look less at proclamations and more at the language of memos, staff notes, and deployment orders. After-action documents and contemporary diaries reveal two recurrent behaviors. First, an emphasis on planning for optimism, detailed timing tables, strict schedules, and committed lift assets. And second, a pragmatic, often private tendency to plan contingencies and to note the plan's weaknesses. Lieutenant General Browning's coordinating papers, for example, capture both a commitment to launch airborne operations simultaneously across several zones
and a weary acknowledgement of the complications posed by limited glider capacity and uncertain weather windows. Montgomery's formal orders showed a commander convinced the plan could work. His staff notes and some staff officers' marginalia reveal that he and his planners recognized the operation's dependence on a tight timeline. Small scenes make those abstractions human. Imagine a British planning room in early September, maps strewn across a long table, an aerial photograph of Ninehoven pinned to the wall, and officers tracing the intended corridor with fingers impatient for ink. Montgomery, according to staff minutes, outlined the plan with the kind of emphatic gestures that made his intent unmistakable. Seize the bridges, relieve the airborne, and press on. Around the table, chiefs of staff wrote notes.
A young operations officer, later to become a brigade planner, recorded in a private notebook the tension between admiration for the audacity and a private anxiety about the roadway's fragility. That notebook, one of many fragmentary sources historians rely on, does not capture inner monologue so much as the factual residue of doubts that circulated at lower echelons. Roy Urquhart, in his division's assembly areas, felt the burden of a specific task that left no margin for slow relief. His operational orders, preserved in division records, fixed his division's objective around Arnhem Bridge and defined the holding period before relief was expected. Urquhart's staff worked through platoon-level plans to secure the northern approaches, to block counterattacks, and to prepare for the possibility of being isolated. Those were not abstract possibilities. Battalion commanders and company leaders rehearsed routes, coded messages, and contingency fallback locations. The airborne soldiers who would land at Arnhem had been trained for holding ground against heavier forces for short intervals, but the notion of days rather than hours for relief was a psychological steepening of an already daunting assignment. Memoirs and later interviews with veterans convey the uncanny smallness of being a handful of men with light anti-tank weapons watching heavy German armor funneling through country roads. Yet those accounts, while vivid, represent retrospective memory and must be interpreted as such. Another vignette brings Frederick Browning's staff work into focus. Charged with coordinating transport aircraft and glider lifts, Browning confronted the practical arithmetic of pylons, tow ropes, and runway capacity. He had to allocate scarce lifts across multiple drop zones, balance the loading of anti-tank guns and jeeps into fragile gliders, and juggle meteorological reports that could delay launches at any moment. The logistical choreography was exacting and unforgiving. Staff minutes show Browning arguing for heavier lift allocations to Arnhem. He knew relief could be delayed if the ground force encountered even modest resistance, but available lift was constrained by competing commitments and the finite number of transport aircraft. Those resource debates were not academic. They translated directly into whether an airborne force could be reinforced and resupplied in time. At the Allied headquarters level, Eisenhower's cables and notes do not reveal dramatic rejection of Market Garden. Rather, they indicate a posture of conditional approval, seeking to sustain overall momentum while steering available resources. He approved the operation, but insisted on certain requirements: close air support where feasible, clear lines of communication, and contingency airlift plans should the ground corridor suffer delays.
In private memos, Eisenhower recorded the need to balance ambition with prudence, language that suggests concern about risk. But his overriding objective was to maintain harmony in the coalition and exploit German weakness while it presented itself. Political pressure cannot be ignored when assessing leaders' thinking. The public mood in Britain and the United States in autumn 1944 demanded progress. Newspapers and broadcast commentary lauded bold plans that promised to end the war sooner. Political leaders read those headlines and asked their military commanders for bold strategies. That external demand interacted with internal military culture. For Montgomery, who had a reputation to defend and a vision to advance, Market Garden presented an opportunity for strategic theater. For Eisenhower, a politician at scale, the calculus included maintaining Allied unity and steering clear of operations that would risk public confidence in the campaign. Those political variables shaped what leaders chose to emphasize in public and what they reserved for private memos. Yet intelligence and the operational reality of terrain tempered the rhetoric. Reconnaissance pilots who flew over the Arnhem area reported columns and concentrations that suggested German armor was closer than some planners anticipated. Dutch resistance cells supplied spot reports of troop movements and vehicle concentrations. Their local knowledge warned that German units were being reassembled and that some bridges behind the line were intact and usable. Signals intelligence registered German radio traffic indicating the movement and refitting of armored elements within striking distance of the proposed corridor.
How those fragments were weighted determined outcomes. In some headquarters, the intelligence was treated as ambiguous, curious, but not decisive. In others, officers sounded alarms. When the operation's start date, September 17, 1944, was set, planners across the chain felt both the electric thrill of imminent action and the heavy realism of contingency. The calendar imposed a discipline. Wind windows, aircraft availability, and the supply line's reach had to be synchronized. Yet beneath that schedule lay the persistent worry. What if the ground link could not advance at the planned pace? What if, as some local reports suggested, SS Panzer elements were present in the Arnhem vicinity? Those were not mere hypothetical queries. Documents circulated in the days leading to September 17th record staff officers inserting tentative alternative plans and proposed holding patterns, while others struck such hedges from draft orders to avoid undermining confidence or clogging command with conditional directives. The pattern that emerges from these records is not uniform uncertainty.
Rather, it is a layered, contested consensus. Montgomery and his advocates endorsed the plan with an operational optimism born of boldness. Browning and his airborne staff acknowledged heavy risk, but worked to mitigate it through careful lift and supply planning. Urquhart and his division prepared to execute a difficult, time-sensitive holding action. Horrocks and XXX Corps staff planned a rapid push, acutely aware that the corridor would become a linear target. Eisenhower accepted the gamble within a broader political calculus that made outright rejection politically and strategically costly. This is not to say that everyone believed success was assured. Some Corps-level officers and a handful of intelligence analysts counseled caution, pointing to evidence of armored activity and the logistical brittleness of a single road advance. In internal reports, their reservations were recorded with varying degrees of emphasis. Historians who have mined those files infer that at the margins, commanders closer to the ground understood vulnerabilities earlier than some of their superiors in command rooms farther from the front. Whether those concerns were loud enough to alter the final decision is an empirical question that winds through the tapestry of memoranda, radio logs, and diaries left by participants. Tactical rehearsal and local planning translated the strategic blueprint into human experiences. On a silty dawn in September, gliders and transport planes would stage across England, filled with men and material whose fate would hinge on narrow crossings and the speed of relief. Battalion commanders rehearsed the seizure of bridges and urban approaches. Artillery officers prepared firing plans to cover roadblocks. Engineers packed their bridging equipment into fragile gliders that, if destroyed, could not be replaced by the hour. In the earthen quiet before the lifts, unit logs show officers noting the criticality of achieving the first day objectives. Those notes, minor archival entries, reveal an undercurrent of sober focus among the soldiers, tasked with turning theory into action. As the launch hour approached, intelligence briefs continued to offer mixed signals. Some aerial reconnaissance showed clear approaches to Arnhem. Other missions were thwarted by clouds. Intercepts hinted at the presence of armored formations refitting in the general region north of the proposed corridor, though exactly where and in what strength remained to contemporaries often indefinito, unresolved in precise numbers and locations. Staff officers drew up both ideal timetables and contingency scenarios. The tension between the perfectly timed map and the messy reality of roads, weather, and enemy action became sharper with every passing hour. At this point, leaders' private calculations mattered more than ever. Montgomery's publicly stated belief in the plan remained unblinking. In staff records, he reiterated its potential to break directly into Germany.
Eisenhower's cables reflect a commander who accepted the plan's chance against a backdrop of political necessity. Browning and Urquhart prepared men for a holding action that might stretch into days. Horrocks organized armored thrusts meant to thread a fragile needle. The signals intelligence and Dutch reports that suggested the proximity of German armored units hung over these decisions like a storm forecast, not precise enough to force cancellation, but ominous enough to demand contingency. When the engines began to turn on 17 September, they carried with them this complex architecture of belief and doubt. The operation's conception, the personalities who shaped it, the assumptions baked into timelines, and the intelligence inputs that teased and warned, all of it coalesced into a single precarious enterprise. With launch day arrived, the experiment in synchronization between airborne seizure and armored relief moved from planning rooms into the skies and roads. What leaders had thought, and how those thoughts would be tested, was about to be revealed by events few of them could fully control. If you want this deep dive unpacked in more detail as we trace the operation hour by hour, from the airborne landings to the grinding corridors of 30X Corps, subscribe and stay with this analysis. There is more to come that will follow this hour-by-hour reckoning and the moments where planning met the unforgiving realities of the battlefield. The first planes crossed the North Sea on a crisp morning.
The initial drops and glider landings would quickly produce a mixture of success and complication. At Eindhoven and Grave, airborne elements found opportunities to seize crossings and support the ground link. At Nijmegen, gains proved more complicated than planners expected. The river crossing there required not only seizing the bridge, but also coordinating riverbank assaults and improvised engineering under fire. Communications, always a fragile thread in fast-moving operations, began to fray in pockets, complicating synchronization between airborne units and their expected relief. Some of these early frictions were foreseeable in staff papers. Engineers had noted potential bottlenecks at bridges, and traffic control plans showed the vulnerability of tank columns funneling through constricted roadways. But the lived effect, brigades halted by rubble, armored spearheads waiting for cleared bridges, liaison failures and radio relay, was harsher than the sanitized timing tables suggested. In several locations, paratroopers achieved tactical surprises. In others, misdrops scattered units and produced delays that would have strategic consequences. One microcosm of the unfolding dilemma occurred north of Nijmegen. A light column of airborne troops had seized a bridgehead, and on maps the ground forces appeared to be within striking distance.
On the ground, however, a choke point, a ruined viaduct, and a congested causeway translated into hours of lost momentum for tanks and support vehicles. Reconnaissance reports indicated German elements nearby, and local resistance messages warned of enemy reinforcements moving up on secondary roads. Those hours of delay eroded the margin that planners had assumed would be ample. The chain of assumptions, seize, hold, link up, was beginning to show hairline fractures. At Arnhem, the picture that emerged for commanders on the ground was more urgent. 1st Airborne's dispositions put Urquhart's men in the role of seizing a critical bridge, but also of holding it against potentially superior forces for a period that, in some contingency models, could be measured in days rather than hours. Reconnaissance and later intelligence reviews would highlight that German armored units were present in the area in greater strength than some planners had believed. Contemporary signals and Dutch reports had hinted at this before the operation began. The practical effect of armored concentrations, visibility of tracked vehicles, the sound of engines, was now manifesting where airborne units had little capacity to confront it directly. Commanders in the rear were not blind to these developments. Staff officers in Corps and Army headquarters tracked the movement of units and the rate of progress. Their assessments, recorded in situation reports and operational logs, began to diverge. Optimistic entries emphasized bridges seized and units in position. More cautious notes cataloged delays, misdrops, and the absence of expected mechanized support at critical junctures. These synchronous but conflicting records reveal the gulf between the plan's tidy expectations and the messy operational tempo of combat. Throughout these early hours, the question of what Allied leaders really thought did not evaporate into posturing or denial. Instead, it became visible in the choices they made under pressure. Which reserves to commit, where to direct air resupply, how loudly to press subordinate commanders for timetables they might be unable to meet. A recurring theme in their recorded behavior was not simple faith or fear, but the active negotiation of risk, an attempt to steer events without losing initiative, to accept measured losses for possible strategic gain, and to remain politically credible while not offering guarantees that could not be kept. That negotiation would define the next critical phase of Market Garden, the stretch between early tactical successes and the crushing operational crisis that beckoned at Arnhem. In the planning rooms, in the glider release zones, and in the cramped command vehicles of Deck's Corps, leaders were making minute decisions that would later be weighed, praised, and questioned. The evidence left in maps and memos shows that they thought in layers, publicly in terms of movement and conquest, privately in terms of contingencies and risk.
What remained to be seen as the operation unfolded was which of those layers would determine fate. When the first days of Market Garden yielded both promise and complication, commanders at every level found themselves translating broad intent into immediate, often wrenching choices. The operational choreography that had looked so neat on the map, paratroopers taking bridges, tanks flowing up a single axis, engineers keeping choke points open, was now colliding with minute realities. Misdrops, fractured radio networks, unpredictable local resistance, and the recurring presence of German armored formations whose exact strength and disposition remained, in many places, indefinitive. The market phase, the airborne landings, produced quick, localized victories that masked a deeper fragility.
In the south, the U.S. 101st Airborne at Eindhoven and other elements met less coordinated opposition and were able to secure important crossings that protected the initial flank of the corridor. These successes reflected solid training, effective small unit initiative, and the tangible advantage that surprise still offered in certain pockets. A day's drive north, at Grave and places along the corridor spine, airborne units achieved tactical footholds that validated aspects of the plan: bold insertion, speed of action, and a limited capacity to hold key points while the ground transport advanced. Nijmegen, however, presented a microcosm of the operation's larger challenge. On paper, the capture of Nijmegen and its bridge should have been a clear-cut link in the chain. On the ground, urban resistance, confusing river approaches, and the necessity of coordinated river crossings made what looked like a textbook objective into a protracted fight. Paratroopers or Enopian glider forces fought for bridgeheads and had to improvise engineering solutions while armor and support units approached. The result was a delay that, when measured in hours and then in a day, began to erode the margin planners had treated as comfortable. Communication breakdowns amplified these tactical frictions into operational risk. The radios intended to knit together airborne formations with corps-level headquarters suffered from range limitations, interference, and at times outright malfunction on landing. The airborne doctrine of the day assumed a degree of communications resilience that, once tested, proved overstretched. When commanders could not confirm the position of platoons or the status of captured bridges, their ability to push reinforcements, direct fires, or adjust timetables deteriorated. Operational logs from division and corps headquarters record repeated attempts to reconcile fragmentary reports. The resulting ambiguity forced leaders to rely more on pre-planned timelines than on real-time situational awareness. The ground advance, the garden phase, was where the plan's single corridor logic was most exposed.
X-Corps, under Horrocks, faced a literal and figurative bottleneck: narrow causeways, demolished bridges, and a traffic density that turned speed into patience. Tank brigades queued behind engineers as they fought to clear craters and collapsed spans. Reconnaissance scouts were channeled into predictable lanes where they could be interdicted. These were not merely tactical headaches, but strategic erosions of the operation's central assumption that pace could outrun response. Each hour spent clearing wreckage or waiting for a recoilless gun to be bridged was an hour in which German forces could reorganize and move armor towards threatened nodes. The presence of German armored forces in the broader Arnhem region had, before the operation, been a subject of contentious interpretation. Signals intelligence and Dutch resistance reports had suggested activity consistent with refitting armored units. Aerial photographs were ambiguous in places. Some intelligence summaries circulated to planning staffs flagged the existence of mechanized formations that might threaten the corridor. Other analysts judged those indicators as dispersed or not immediately decisive. Post-operation reviews identified that elements of German 2 SS Panzer Corps and other armored formations were in fact present within operational reach, information consistent with later archival analyses. For leaders in the moment, however, that recognition arrived as a gradient rather than a binary fact: pockets of evidence that required judgment calls about risk acceptance, the allocation of reserves, and the timing of advances. As the ground route inched north, two practical problems consistently disrupted momentum. First, traffic control management underestimated the compounding effects of battlefield attrition. Broken down vehicles, abandoned transport, and destroyed bridging equipment rapidly converted a two-lane road into a one-lane funnel. Second, small but effective German delaying actions, roadblocks, demolition, and hit-and-run anti-tank teams created cascading delays that disproportionately affected heavier mechanized elements. Corps-level plans had modeled some of these contingencies, but the scale of friction was greater than simulation had suggested. Situation reports and after-action summaries from Horrocks' headquarters show repeated notes on congestion, mechanical attrition, and the consequent loss of tempo. That loss of tempo had strategic consequences. Every hour beyond the projected schedule widened the window available to German commanders to concentrate forces against isolated airborne pockets. It also complicated command-level decision-making higher up the chain. Should commanders divert additional armor to accelerate the push, thereby risking other sectors? Should they hold the timetable and accept mounting casualties among isolated airborne troops? Or should they call for expanded air resupply, an option limited by aircraft availability and weather?
These were not academic choices. They were decisions taken under incomplete information and the pressure of public expectation. Arnhem crystallized the operation's central dilemma. Urquhart's 1st Airborne Division had been tasked with seizing the bridge at Arnhem and holding it until relieved. In the first hours, some elements pushed toward the northern end of the span, but the distribution of forces upon landing, misdrops, and unexpected German concentrations prevented the massing of the force Urquhart had wished for. Instead of an overwhelming occupation of the bridge and its approaches, a thin cordon of British paratroopers found themselves engaged in a fight for urban blocks and hemmed in by the appearance of armored elements that could not be confronted effectively by light infantry and the limited anti-tank weapons available to them. Those who studied the intelligence picture after the fact have pointed to a series of missed signals that, had they been weighted differently, might have shifted the planner's risk calculus. Contemporary ultra-decrypts and intercepted communications indicated increased traffic and refitting around Arnhem, data later corroborated in war diaries and unit logs. Dutch resistance reports alarmed at the visibility of tracked vehicles in nearby towns were sent through channels that, according to some staff notes, arrived in commanding headquarters with insufficient geolocation to be decisive. The air reconnaissance that might have clarified these reports was sometimes grounded by poor weather or was constrained by priorities elsewhere. Taken together, these information gaps created an epistemic environment in which leaders, Montgomery, Eisenhower, Browning, and others, had to place bets with imperfect cards. Montgomery's response as events leaned toward crisis was, in keeping with his established pattern, to project confidence and to press for continued effort. Staff minutes reveal him emphasizing the necessity of pressing forward and the dangers of retreating from audacious aims. Montgomery's public posture was emphatic. Privately, his staff papers reveal an understanding, if not full acceptance, of the operation's fragility. Montgomery's operational philosophy, a preference for bold, concentrated effort intended to deliver decisive results, shaped how he interpreted emerging setbacks, not as signals to abort, but as conditions to redouble effort. That interpretive frame was persuasive to many who shared his appetite for initiative, but it was less convincing to those who highlighted the cumulative tactical barriers. Eisenhower's posture retained its balancing act. His approval of Market Garden had been conditional. As delays accumulated, his cables and staff communications show him urging careful assessment of the changing situation. He weighed two competing imperatives: to preserve the operation's momentum and to avoid unnecessary loss.
In private correspondence after the battle, some of which survives in archive collections, Eisenhower expressed concern about risk levels, even as he acknowledged the political pressures that had influenced earlier endorsements. This duality is emblematic of the high command tension, endorsing boldness while carrying responsibility for lives and the broader coalition strategy. Subordinate commanders, those closer to the clogged roads and the engaged airborne companies, generated a different kind of record. Horrocks, in his operational journals, chronicled the crushing difficulty of keeping tanks moving through a landscape not designed for an armored flood. Field reports from brigade and battalion level catalog abandoned vehicles, destroyed bridges, and local counterattacks that had forced rerouting and delay. Urquhart's war diary, as well as testimonies recorded in post-war interviews and official division summaries, underline the combination of improvisation and missed opportunities that characterized the Arnhem fight. Brave small unit actions, attempts to stiffen defensive perimeters, and desperate, sometimes improvised, attempts to call for reinforcement or resupply. The Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade's role at Driel illustrates the human and logistical interplay of the operation's failure to wholly cohere. Ordered to cross the Rhine and attempt to reinforce the remnants of 1st Airborne, Polish units performed with determination under difficult riverine conditions. Their assaults, conducted under fire, with limited river crossing equipment and precarious local support, failed to establish a sustained relief corridor in time to change the division's fate. The Polish endeavor is often cited in historiography as emblematic of how brave, tactically competent actions could not by themselves substitute for a failing operational linkage. Throughout the crisis, leaders at Allied headquarters oscillated between attempting to salvage the original plan and adjusting to the accumulating facts on the ground. Airborne commanders requested more supplies dropped into pockets. Corps commanders asked for reinforcements and bridging equipment. High command papers show repeated advisories about the operational consequences of delay. The longer the ground relief took, the more tenuous the airborne positions became. What leaders really thought in those hours is visible in the choices they made, professing resolve, allocating reserves where possible, but rarely in the heat of the moment, opting for wholesale retraction of the original aim. After-action analyses and the immediate public statements that followed the operation are unsurprisingly different things. In public communications, Allied leadership sought to maintain morale and to frame Market Garden as a bold operation that had achieved partial success while acknowledging losses.
Politically and strategically, an outright admission of failure on the scale of the operation would have had consequences for domestic support and Allied cohesion. Privately, however, the records show a more complex set of appraisals. Montgomery, while defending his strategic intent, accepted in staff notes that timing and mechanical attrition had been underestimated. Eisenhower's personal papers, again as an archival matter, hint at regret over the gamble's timing and scope, though not, in those same notes, a wish that the attempt had never been made. Browning's internal correspondence highlights the difficulty of balancing lift allocation with the impracticality of reinforcing thinly spread airborne units in contested territory. These layered responses, where public reassurance overlapped with private reassessment, were characteristic of the Allied leadership culture.
Responsibility and blame became contested in the months after the operation. Official inquiries and armored staff reviews parsed the timeline for moments that could be characterized as decisive errors. Some critiques emphasized the inherent vulnerability of a single corridor. Others pointed to specific tactical mistakes, mishandled traffic control, underestimation of enemy armored presence, and the unreliability of certain radio sets. In the culture of inter-allied command, assigning sole culpability was difficult and often counterproductive. Public censure of a single commander risked undermining Allied unity at a delicate moment. Consequently, formal reports frequently diluted direct blame into a catalog of contributing factors. Historians, with the benefit of broader documentation and the ability to compare diverse archives, have since offered more textured appraisals. The consensus in much scholarship is not a simple indictment of hubris, nor an exculpation of leadership courage. Rather, it characterizes Market Garden as an operation where reasonable strategic aim, shortening the war by seizing a crossing into Germany, met with executional constraints that were not fully reconciled in planning. The single corridor concept, while attractive for its economy of force and potential for speed, created systemic vulnerability that, when coupled with intelligence ambiguity and logistical stress, produced results that fell short of the plan's ambitions. One important nuance concerns the handling of intelligence. The operations planners received multiple streams of information, signals intercepts, aerial photos, resistance reports, but the fusion of those sources was imperfect. Where one staff might have read the mosaic of data as an actionable warning, another read it as a series of non-conclusive indications. In the aftermath, critics have argued that a different weighting of certain intelligence items, or more aggressive reconnaissance, might have produced a different allocation of resources, perhaps directing heavier anti-armor assets, or adjusting drop zones. Other analysts cautioned against counterfactual certainty, the same wartime constraints that hampered decision-making, limited aircraft, competing priorities, and political pressure, would likely have complicated alternative options as well. The mythology that grew around Market Garden, summarized crudely in the phrase, "a bridge too far," compressed a complex operational episode into a moral of hubris. That shorthand does capture an essential truth about risk. Operations that reach for decisive effects across fragile lines invite disproportionate consequences when one link breaks. But the reality of leadership thinking at the time was more mixed. Montgomery embraced risk as a method for seeking decisive outcomes. This was consistent with his temperament and previous operational choices. Eisenhower, who had the burden of coalition politics and strategic balance, permitted the gamble while seeking mitigations. Corps and division commanders recognized the hazards on the ground and attempted mitigation within constraints they did not control. Far from a simple story of arrogance punished, Market Garden was a layered decision, made in a theater of uncertainty by leaders operating under political and logistical pressures. The human cost of these strategic and operational judgments was concentrated in moments of sharp tragedy. Paratroopers, isolated and outgunned, fought day after day with dwindling supplies. Civilians in Dutch towns endured crossfire, occupation, and in some cases reprisals. Medical units and local volunteers attempted to evacuate the wounded as best they could, often under fire. These scenes do not serve to assign blame, so much as to remind the historian that the abstract calculations of high command have immediate consequences for soldiers and civilians alike. Contemporary letters, unit casualty summaries, and municipal records capture that costly intersection between grand plans and human lives. Institutionally, Market Garden produced doctrinal lessons that reverberated into post-war military thought. Single-axis operations, the necessity for robust logistics and redundant communications, and the requirements of reliable intelligence fusion all entered professional debates. Airborne doctrine, too, was reassessed. The limits of lightly armed airborne light infantry holding against mechanized counterattack became clearer, prompting revisions in how airborne units were to be used in combined arms planning. These adaptations were not quick or seamless. Institutional cultures are slow to change, and the post-war era saw both continuity with past thinking and the gradual incorporation of Market Garden's hard-earned lessons. Returning to the central question, what Allied leaders really thought about Operation Market Garden, we can offer a layered answer rather than a single verdict. Strategically, many at the top saw the operation as a potentially war-shortening maneuver, and that potential made the risk palatable. Politically, leaders in London and Washington were receptive to operations that might deliver quicker results, which constrained the room for outright rejection at the military level. Operationally, planners like Montgomery viewed the plan as consistent with their preferred mode of warfare, decisive, centralized thrusts, while airborne and corps commanders were acutely aware of the plan's fragile dependencies. Tactically, units on the ground recognized the limits of what light infantry could do in isolation and the degree to which mechanical and logistical friction could delay relief. In private memos and diaries, a pattern emerges: endorsement accompanied by hedging. Memos record concern about German armor and the brittleness of the corridor. Staff notes ask for contingency lifts and additional bridging. Some officers' marginalia express unease. These reservations were often pragmatic rather than fatalistic. They were requests for resources, calls for clearer reconnaissance, or notes on timing that might avert disaster. They were not universal vetoes. Rather, they reflected an operational culture that accepted risk within what leaders perceived as a tolerable envelope. After the operation failed to produce its strategic objective, many of those same leaders, in public statements and private reflections, adjusted their accounts to emphasize the mitigating factors: intelligence shortfalls, equipment failures, and unforeseeable local resistance. Several specific evidence-based points sharpen this broader picture. First, intelligence summaries prior to and during the operation did indicate the presence of German armored formations in the wider Arnhem area. Later archival research aligns with the contemporaneous warnings that some intelligence analysts forwarded. Second, planners explicitly recorded the plan's reliance on tight timing and the difficulties of resupply by air. Those operational assumptions are visible in orders and coordinating papers. Third, the failure to achieve a rapid and uninterrupted link-up from 33rd Corps to Arnhem was a decisive operational factor. Traffic congestion, destroyed infrastructure, and localized counterattacks combined to slow the advance enough to impair airborne holdings. Finally, post-attack reviews and later historical syntheses show that leadership responses varied. Some defended the gamble as necessary, others expressed regret over the risk profile accepted. It is important to mark speculation where it appears. It is tempting to imagine that, had a single variable changed, a rainless week, a fuller complement of radio sets, a different allocation of transports, the operation would have succeeded. Such counterfactuals are instructive for exploring causal chains, but remain speculative.
The archival record supports the conclusion that different weightings of intelligence, or greater resources in particular nodes, might have improved tactical outcomes. Whether they would have altered the strategic result is indefinitive. Historians must therefore balance what evidence indicates happened with what might have been possible under altered conditions. Ultimately, the verdict on what Allied leaders really thought is not binary. They thought in gradients, from bold strategic hope to cautious operational contingency to stark tactical concern. Montgomery championed a high-risk, high-reward approach consistent with his doctrine. Eisenhower accepted the risk while managing coalition pressures and broader strategic responsibilities. Subordinate commanders documented and sometimes voiced the local dangers posed by terrain, logistics, and enemy action. The divergence between public rhetoric and private assessment is not proof of hypocrisy so much as an artifact of leadership under pressure. Public morale demanded optimism, even while staff notebooks recorded the variables of danger. Market Garden's legacy, therefore, is both operational and moral. It underscored the limits of audacious maneuvers when not buttressed by redundant lines of supply, clear and fused intelligence, and robust lateral mobility. It reminded commanders that the human agency of junior leaders and civilians can pivotally shape larger outcomes, and it illustrated how political expectations can constrain commanders' freedom to choose purely military options. These lessons would seep into later operations and doctrinal revisions, shaping both the immediate conduct of the final months of the war and subsequent military learning. When historians sift the memos, diaries, and operational logs, the narrative that emerges is one of complex human decision-making under pressure. Leaders did not act out of reckless arrogance or blind faith. They acted with a combination of hope, calculation, and the constraints of imperfect information. Some choices reflected plausible military judgment, shaped by the agencies of the moment. Others, in retrospect, appear as avoidable miscalculations. The balance between audacity and prudence is the perennial dilemma of wartime command, and Market Garden remains a vivid case study of that tension. If you take away a single, evidence-rooted conclusion, it is this: Allied leaders thought Market Garden was worth trying, but many of them, at different times and in different ways, also thought it was perilously dependent on factors that might fail. The operation was a calculated risk, rather than a consensus of assured success, and its outcome reflected both the bravery of those who fought and the unavoidable imperfections of large-scale coordination under fire. Now, what do you think?
Was Market Garden an indispensable gamble that deserved the chance, or a miscalculation born of misweighed intelligence and overconfidence?
Share your view in the comments. And if you want to follow more deep dive analyses into Allied campaigns and leadership decisions, check the playlist linked in the description.